Few historians are able to bring history to life as well as Stephen Ambrose. He is the best-selling author of D-Day as well as biographies of Presidents Eisenhower and Nixon. In his latest work, Undaunted Courage, he revisits the opening of the American West with a look at Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, and the adventure that brought them together. For 20 years, the Lewis and Clark expedition has been an obsession of Ambrose. He retraced their journey several times with his family, and in addition to revealing a new dimension to this story, he also reveals a bit about Stephen Ambrose himself. I am pleased to have him on this broadcast to talk about Meriwether Lewis and the extraordinary journey that took him across this country. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to have you back.
Thank you.
Listen to this. Books by Stephen Ambrose. Upton and the Army, Halleck, Lincoln's Chief of Staff, Ike's Spies, Ride to Globalism, Crazy Horse and Custer, Eisenhower in Berlin, Duty on a Country, History of West Point, The Supreme Commander, the years of General Eisenhower, Eisenhower Soldier, General of the Army, Eisenhower, Pegasus Bridge, Nixon, Eisenhower again, Nixon, and then Band of Brothers E Company at 500th Regiment, then D-Day, June 6, 1944, the climactic battles of World War II. If I look at all those books and add this to it, is there a theme there? Is there something in all of those stories that brings historian Stephen Ambrose to the pen?
Leadership. I'm fascinated by leadership. It's something that I don't do. I'm a college teacher and a writer, but I am fascinated by leaders and how do they do it. And their techniques vary enormously. Eisenhower and Nixon couldn't have been more different, for example. And they couldn't be more different from Meriwether Lewis, but they all were leaders. And this is what I'm looking for in my studies, and I'm trying to find and explore and trying to see what works and what doesn't. With regard to Meriwether Lewis, he was, in my mind, and I've been studying the United States Army all my career, as good a company commander as the U.S. Army ever produced.
I want to put him aside for a second and stay with some other things and come back to this book and this story, because it's an extraordinary story that you have invested a lot of time in. But looking at leadership, what defines leadership? I mean, what do all these different people have, at least as one common denominator of their capacity to lead?
That's what's fascinating. There isn't one.
None.
None.
Even though they're different people, I recognize that. There's no one thing that... Strip away all the differences, and there's one thing you'd come back to.
Well, I shouldn't say none. Follow me is, of course, basic, but it just goes without saying. You don't lead by pushing from behind. You lead by getting out
and you don't lead if you don't think you can lead.
Oh, that's right. An enormous self-confidence. That's a part of it, too, to be sure. But Douglas MacArthur was a great leader. Dick Nixon was certainly a successful leader for a long time.
Yeah.
Both of them lied all the time. Ike hardly ever lied in his whole life.
Yeah.
He lied to Khrushchev about what Francis Gary Powers was doing, and that was about it.
But that's different. And MacArthur lied in pursuit of building up his own image.
Absolutely. That's right. And he lied about things that he had done. And he lied to cover up. And he was a habitual liar. But he was also a very successful general.
And a brilliant strategist.
Yeah. Yeah.
Colin Powell. You desperately want him to run for president.
Absolutely.
You were one of those people out there pushing and pushing and pushing.
He is, I think, the best leader America has produced in this second half of the 20th century. When you want to talk about leadership, there's a man who leads. There's a man who came out of Vietnam at a time when everybody else was saying goodbye to the U.S. Army, and it was in the worst shape our Army has ever been in 1975. Drugs and fragging and everything else was going on. Colin Powell and others, but Powell most of all was the one who stayed in there and said, we're going to bring this Army back. And we've got an Army today, Charlie, that is the best we've ever put into the field.
All volunteer.
That helped enormously. It couldn't have been done with a conscript Army, that's right. But we've got an Army that is free of drugs, that is free of racism. We've got an Army that is... Did you see those engineers putting up that bridge in Bosnia?
Right.
Wasn't that the most impressive thing?
Powell's political skills.
Oh, they're very finely honed. He's very like Eisenhower in that. He's spent an awful lot of time in Washington.
He was a Washington general for a long time.
He's a Washington general for a long time. He's done his duty in the field, but he's been inside the halls of Congress a lot, and he knows his way around, and he's very diplomatic, very suave, very smooth, very much of a consensus builder. He knows how to work Washington, I think, as well as Bob Dole does.
Do you think there is any chance he will reconsider because he's so concerned about his party, about the future and will hear the call of duty?
God, I hope so. You asked me, do I think so? I have to tell you, I don't think he's going to do it in '96. Partly because I don't think it's possible, because he's already said, I don't want it, and I don't think the Republican delegates in San Diego are going to be willing to turn the nomination over to a man who refused to fight for it.
And why should they?
To save the party and to save the country, that's why. I mean, they don't want to be suicidal either.
You think if Bob Dole or Lamar Alexander gets the nomination, they can't win?
Yes, I agree. They can't win.
Okay. Let me turn to Meriwether Lewis. Tell me about him. Because he had a very short life, but he put a lot into it.
He was a Virginia planter, a neighbor of Jefferson's. His father had died when he was 6. Jefferson was a father figure to him. He went into the Army. Jefferson called him to Washington when he became president and made Meriwether Lewis his secretary. And Lewis lived in the White House with Jefferson for the next 2 years. Remember one of Jack Kennedy's most famous lines when he had all those Nobel Prize winners in the White House for dinner, and he said, this is the biggest gathering of talent the White House has ever seen, except when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. Thomas Jefferson didn't dine alone.
Meriwether Lewis was always there.
Always there. He was the beloved aide. He was a son figure to Jefferson, who never had a son. And Jefferson gave him advanced courses in botany, zoology, embryology, ornithology, meteorology, the works, and turned him into a Renaissance man who had a breadth of knowledge that you couldn't find an undergraduate in America today that could come close to it, and damn few graduate students, and damn few people either. I can't do it. So he was marvelously trained by Jefferson for an express purpose.
He wanted
to become the first American to cross this continent and to go into that heart of darkness, which was the Louisiana Purchase. When Jefferson bought Louisiana, all he knew was that it was big. He had no idea what was nobody and cheap, yeah. Nobody knew what was out there, and it had to be explored. And he picked Lewis for this express purpose and gave him this training that was as good as the training the astronauts get today, but broader. And then sent him out to cross the continent from Washington D.C. Tidewater all the way to Astoria, Oregon,
to find a water route to the west.
And many other things, to find out what's new out there. And Lewis came back with 110 new plant species and 100 new animals and birds that he had described and collected, to find an all-water route, to make peace among those Indian tribes so that American entrepreneurs could go out into the trans-Mississippi country and get into that fur trade, which was the immediately exploitable wealth of the Louisiana Purchase. And many other things involved in it. Fixing latitude and longitude and so on. And Lewis led this platoon of men, 30 men, plus one black slave, plus one Indian teenage girl, plus one infant.
And the Indian teenage girl had an infant. Yeah. And that probably kept them from being attacked.
Yes, it did, absolutely. Because the Indian tribes, when they saw that there was a squaw with a papoose on her back among this party of big, husky young Kentuckians and Tennesseans who had volunteered for this expedition, they knew it was not a war party.
Why else was
Because
she?
a war party would never take a woman and a child along.
Yeah. And why else was she important to the mission?
Well, the greatest myth about the expedition is that she was the guide. Now, that's just silly. She was captured at the Three Forks in Montana when she was 8 years old. She was a slave. She'd been sold to this Frenchman named Charbonneau. And what she had that the expedition had to have was not, how do we get out there? Because they were just following the Missouri River. You don't need a guide to do that. You just keep going upstream. But she could talk in Shoshone and in Hidatsa. Her husband talked Hidatsa in French, and then many members of the expedition could take that French into English, and so there was a chain of translation available, thanks to Sacagawea, that made it possible for Lewis and Clark, when they got to the mountains, to trade with the Shoshones for horses. So as a translator, she was invaluable, but she made many other contributions. On 2 occasions when they were close to starvation, she found roots for them. She used her native skills and found some roots and dug them up and saved the expedition. Once one of the canoes tipped and her husband was in a panic, and the papers and the journals, these most priceless things that just one of the great of American treasures, are floating down the Missouri River. And Charbonneau was in a panic, and the men didn't know what to do, and this 13 or 14-year-old girl with her papoose on her back went out and got those journals and got those scientific instruments and saved them all.
I'm going to jump around here. What was the most important thing that this journey, this expedition brought back?
Brought back?
Yes.
The map.
The map.
The map. The cartography was the most important immediate thing, and it opened the way for the fur rush that went out to the Louisiana Purchase country. The second most important thing was an American citizen had stepped into that great Northwestern Empire that is today's Oregon and Washington and Idaho, and that made our claim to that Northwestern Empire. So it added greatly to the territory of the Louisiana Purchase. The scientific fruits of the expedition were these new plants and these new animals never before seen. These guys went into a Garden of Eden. In the Garden of Eden, you just reach out and grab your food, right? Mm. When they're going down the Missouri River, they had to push the buffalo out of the way. The geese and the swans and the ducks on the river it impeded their progress. They were in such fabulous quantities. Lewis and Clark and the men of the Corps of Discovery saw things that no human being will ever see again, and no white man had ever seen before.
They were the first non-Native American to see coyotes,
prairie dogs, buffalo, grizzly bears.
None of them had been seen before.
None had ever been seen before.
Expedition.
They hadn't seen a grizzly, of course, and the the Indians that they wintered with in 0405, the Mandans near present Bismarck, North Dakota, warned them about the grizzlies. And Lewis said, oh, you know, these Indians, I know they really are frightened of these bears, and they prepare for them as if they were going for a war party. But they've got these indifferent British muskets and these little silly bow and arrow. We've got Kentucky long rifles. Let me at those grizzlies. The first grizzly they encountered, they shot him 13 times, 4 through the lungs, 2 through the heart, 1 through the head before they knocked that bear over. The second one pretty much the same. After 3 or 4 more grizzlies, Lewis commented in the journals, I find that the curiosity of the men with regard to these bears is pretty well satisfied.
Now, let me turn this to you. Legend has it, sir, that you've been planning to write a novel about this.
I did write a novel.
But you couldn't? What was the problem?
It wasn't any problem. I wrote the novel. I thought it was pretty good, and my editor didn't. She said, Steve, go back to writing history.
So, it wasn't any good.
I mean, that's what she said. I thought it was good.
Why didn't you take it to other places?
Because I trust Alice. If Alice says it's no good, it's no good. I had a terrible time trying to do sex. Just an awful time. And how can you have a novel you don't have some sex in?
Yeah, and this was the story. How did you see it? Through what character?
George Shannon, who was a 19-year-old, the youngest member of the expedition, who went on to, what appealed to me was he was the most literate member of the expedition, except for the captains. And he went on to become a friend of Henry Clay's, and then went on to be a judge in Missouri after it became a state. So he had a very good post-expedition career, and he was bright and he was literate, and I did it in the form of George Shannon's diary. We know there are diaries from the enlisted men that are out there that have not yet come to light.
And they're hidden somewhere.
Well,
somebody's house or somebody's
attic. About 20 years ago, one of the private's diaries was found in an attic. So that new Lewis and Clark documents are coming to light regularly.
Lewis kept his own journal.
Yes.
And how good was it?
Oh, it's one of the great treasures of American literature. I'd get after my friends in the creative writing department, why don't you guys do more with Lewis and Clark? They, of course, never think about doing that. Meriwether Lewis wrote in a stream of consciousness that, to my mind, is as good as Gertrude Stein or William Faulkner. Lewis can write a sentence that'll cover a whole page, and after you learn to read it aloud and you get the pace of it right and you see where you've got to put in punctuation sometimes, and you get your emphasis right and you get the verb coming out strongly and so on, it just reads like Stein. Stein is also hard to read aloud, of course. Yeah. So is Faulkner. But if you practice and work, you can. Anyway, Lewis was a fabulously good writer.
Did he get that? Did he get that from Jefferson? Or
yes. His writings before he lived in the White House are pretty pedestrian.
Labored.
Yeah. His vocabulary expanded, but his sensitivity and what you can do with words. And he had a quality as a writer that every good storyteller knows you should always stick to, and that is he never flashed forward and he never flashed back. So every time you turn a page, you're a little bit anxious as to what's going to happen next. And he keeps you going that way by this technique.
He is your most favorite American hero.
Yes, that's correct. He's the man I would most want to go on a backpacking trip with. He's the man I would most like to sit around the campfire with. He's not the man I'd most like to have president. The man I'd most like to have president is Dwight Eisenhower or Colin Powell. I don't think Meriwether Lewis would have made a very good general.
But he was a great field commander.
And as a field commander, he was par excellence. And he had a great eye. He could see what was new. They'd sit around the campfire at night, and he's writing in his journal the things he's discovered, and he talks about, to the men, about, geez, I saw this today, I got this plant, I got that prairie dog or whatever the new species is. And he'd see things that they'd been with him. And they'd say to themselves as he talked around the campfire, how the hell did I miss that?
It's surprising there was no mutiny among these men.
Well, this gets back to Lewis was so good as a company commander. Now, he had discipline problems at the start. These are big, strapping young guys. They only took one out of every 100 applicants. Everybody in Kentucky and Tennessee wanted to go on this expedition. So these are tough kids and frontiersmen and heavy drinkers, which very much went with the territory in the frontier. And they had some very serious discipline problems at the beginning of the expedition, which Lewis dealt with very severe discipline. When Private Willard was caught dipping into the whiskey barrel, it was 100 lashes, well laid on, 4 days running. And then in the morning, and then he had to get out and pull his paddle through the day with that bare back, with the sun beating down on it, and then take it again the next. But the men all felt, they didn't have much discipline problem after that. And none at all, actually. A man, in the last 2 years of the expedition, there were no floggings, and there were no court-martials, and there were no disciplines. The men all felt, he's tough, but he's fair. And that's so critical to being a good company commander. The men have to see you that way, and Lewis was that way, so they saw him that way.
What about Clark?
Clark was a great friend of Lewis's. In fact, one of the wonderful stories of American history is the friendship of Lewis and Clark and the partnership. Clark brought to the expedition talents and skills and a temperament that Lewis didn't have, just as Lewis did on his part. Clark was the better waterman, so usually Lewis was walking on shore and Clark was taking care of the keelboat. Clark was the better cartographer. Lewis was way ahead of Clark in the natural sciences, so he did the exploring on land. Clark was more of a frontiersman than Lewis. Lewis was a Virginia gentleman. He inherited a plantation right next to Jefferson's. He lived in sight of Monticello as a boy. And Lewis had a refinement to him. Clark had a rough edge to him, and it just meshed perfectly.
Lewis came back. Jefferson welcomed him back. Jefferson
the whole country welcomed him back. Meriwether Lewis was the first national post-Revolutionary War hero. And he was feted and honored in the White House with the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. All the newspapers were full of Lewis and Clark and what they had found, and so that's how he came back. Right, he came back, our first great national hero.
And then this. Mrs. Grinder began to prepare a bed for him, but he stopped her and said he would sleep on the floor, explaining that since his journey to the Pacific, he would no longer sleep on a feather bed. He had Pernia bring in his bearskins and buffalo robe and spread them on the floor while Pernia was getting the bedding. Lewis found some powder. Miss Grinder went to the kitchen to sleep, and the servants went to the barn some 200 yards distant. Lewis began pacing in his room. This went on for several hours. Miss Grinder, who was frightened and could not sleep, heard him talking aloud like a lawyer. Lewis got out his pistols, he loaded them, and at some time during the early hours of October 11th, shot himself in the head. The ball only grazed his skull. He fell heavily to the floor. Miss Grinder heard him exclaim, "Oh, Lord." Lewis rose and took up his other pistol and shot himself in his breast. The ball entered and passed downward through his body to emerge low down on his backbone. He survived the second shot, staggered to the door of his room, and called out, "Oh, madam, give me some water and heal my wounds." Lewis staggered outside, fell, crawled for some distance, raised himself by the side of a tree, staggered back to his room. He scraped the bucket with the ground with a gourd for water, but the bucket was empty. He collapsed on his robes. At first light, the terrified Miss Grinder sent her children to fetch the servants. When they got to Lewis's room, they found him busily engaged in cutting himself from head to foot with his razor. Lewis saw Pernia and said to him, "I have done the business my good servant gave me. Give me some water." Pernia did. Lewis uncovered his side and showed them the second wound. He said, "I am no coward, but I am so strong. It is so hard to die." He said he had tried to kill himself to deprive his enemies of the pleasure and the honor of doing it. He begged the servants to take the rifle and blow out his brains, telling them not to be afraid, for he would not hurt them, and they could all have the money in his trunk. Shortly after sunrise, his heart stopped beating. Hard to write that.
I just bawled. I wish you wouldn't have read it, actually. I can't take it. I sat, I just bawled. I sat at that computer, and I cried when I wrote about Ike's death. A tear or two. He had a full life and a good death. I was sorry to see him go as I finished the book. A couple of tears. On this one, he's 35 years old. People were talking about him as a president of the United States. As an explorer, he's not far behind Columbus and Cook. He is the most likable human being I've ever known. And this terrible, god-awful end.
Why?
And you just about got me back to it now. Why? Many reasons. Jefferson said he suffered from melancholia, which ran in the family. Jefferson was a great friend of Meriwether Lewis's father, and he said the father also suffered. We'd call it depression today. He was a drug addict. He had malaria, and he popped opium pills for the malaria. One in the morning, one at noon, one at night. As a frontier officer, he was a very heavy drinker, an alcoholic. As a Virginian, he was a land speculator, and when he became governor of Louisiana Territory with headquarters in St. Louis, he got way over his head in land speculation around St. Louis. He was accustomed to writing out a chit whenever he needed anything because Jefferson had given him blank checks before he went on the expedition to supply it. An easy habit to fall into. Now, when he got back out to Louisiana, Jefferson wasn't president anymore. Madison was. And as far as Madison was concerned, Lewis and Clark, that was yesterday. And so the government refused to honor the chits. And that meant every merchant in St. Louis was pounding on Lewis's door, demanding payment. So he was financially ruined, bankrupt. Bigger than those things even, and the saddest of all, he thought of the expedition that it was a failure. They hadn't discovered a Northwest Passage. A process of discovery that had begun in 1492 with Columbus came to an end in 1805 when Lewis saw the Rocky Mountains and realized there is no all-water route through this continent. He had failed to bring peace among the Indian tribes so that we could move the fur empire, we Americans could move the fur empire into that territory. He came back and said, geez, it's so big out there. Now this is, you got to remember, in 1804-06, nothing moved faster than the speed of a horse. And those distances were so vast. And the Federalists, remember, had been after Jefferson very hard on the Louisiana Purchase. Their point was, as one of them said, here he is paying money of which we don't have enough for land of which we've got too much. The Federalists sealed their death warrant with their opposition to the Louisiana Purchase. But Lewis came back feeling, God, those Federalists are probably right. I mean, we're never going to be able to do anything out there. It's just too big. Now, Fulton was running the steamboat up the Hudson River. Lewis could make 10 miles a day going upstream on the Missouri. Fulton could make 10 miles in an hour with his steamboat. But Lewis never saw the steamboat. And, of course, the railroad came in the 1830s. Without the steamboat and the railroad, the Federalists would have been right. The Louisiana Purchase would have been Indian territory.
Let me close this with this question. What did his death do to Thomas Jefferson?
Well, Jefferson was distraught and first of all, personally, he loved Meriwether Lewis.
Like a son.
Like a son. But also because Lewis's death meant that the journals didn't get published. And Jefferson was a man of the Enlightenment. He had all these scientific friends around all of Europe and the United States, and he had been promising them, wait till you see these journals. There's never been anything like it, the discoveries these guys. And of course, Lewis's death meant the journals didn't get published.
Undaunted Courage, Meriwether Lewis, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West by Stephen E. Ambrose. It's great to see you again.
Thank you, Charlie. Good to be with you.
We thank you for joining us. See you tomorrow night. See you Monday night. See you then.